Okay, so we are going to talk briefly about the book of Genesis in this video. I want to start off by hitting a couple of things that I call housekeeping. If this were in a face-to-face class, I would try to start every class by asking, any housekeeping? And what I mean by that is, are there any questions about the class itself, about the process, not just about the material, although students often ask about the material, but is there anything about the class itself or the assignments or the schedule, anything that we need to discuss? So, that being said, housekeeping. It is pretty clear that you have a lot of material this semester. Unfortunately for you, you have an instructor who really enjoys the material and thinks that every question is important. And you probably won't feel that way. And I am very sympathetic to that. I've been in classes where I've had instructors who nerd or geek out about their subject, and I'm just like sitting there going, bruh, I am not on that frequency with you. So here is something of a compromise that I think might help all of us as we're moving through so much material in such a short amount of time, is you have weekly discussion questions. Let's talk about those. You have the weekly discussion questions which come out of the chapters, and so those are listed in Canvas as chapter 1, 2, 3 discussion, chapter 4, 5, 6, and 8, or I think the way that it's laid out in Canvas is chapter 4-8 discussion. And so you see when you open those discussion forums up that they are a series of questions, and those questions come directly out of your textbook. Let me grab a copy here. They come directly out of the end of those chapters. And I'm just kind of flipping here. At the end of chapter 17, we have what looks to be about 4 questions at the end of chapter 17. And I've gone through your textbook, I've copied those questions, and I've put those into those discussion forums. And what I would encourage you to do is I would encourage y'all to break the material apart as much as possible and kind of divvy up the work. So rather than having all of you answering the same 4 questions under yourself into the discussion forum, what I would suggest is that it would probably be more helpful if you would break into teams, or y'all would divvy up the work in some way. So each week, for example, next week where you have chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 and 8, if you were to break that apart, each person could hypothetically answer probably 1 to 2, maybe as many as 2 to 3, 3 to 4 questions each week. And then the other people that you're working with, they can answer those questions that are left unanswered by you. And so this will require all of you to rely on one another to get the questions answered, to look at one another's answers and kind of flesh it out if someone didn't go far enough with their answer, to kind of flesh it out. And I think that will be very helpful as we're divvying up the work. Again, rather than having each individual answering all of these questions for themselves, it's probably more helpful for you on the workload to divvy up the work, and so you're only answering 1 to 4 questions, at max about 4 questions each week, and moving forward from there. And if that's helpful, then you should do it. I would encourage that. You can realistically assume that these questions will reappear at least on the study guide, and more than likely on the final. Remember that you have a comprehensive final in this class, and so those questions will reappear. They're not just discussion questions that you can kind of take or leave. They will reappear in some capacity later on in the semester or later on in the summer. So having a thorough and robust answer is the way that I would encourage you to approach that. There is, however, a problem, and this has already come up with one of you who just emailed me. Thank you, Ainsley, for sending your email this morning. With the literary criticism questions, in week 1, I'm asking you to summarize all the different schools. And what I've also said in the videos is that this is going to take time for us to work through these different theories, and so just kind of hang out with me over the next several weeks. So which one is it? Are you required to answer all the questions now, before we get into the material and before we even have context? Or should you do what I've said previously, which is kind of go with me through these schools of criticism each week? Well, in this particular section, I'm going to say we should just see this as a running document that we're going to continue to answer these questions in the days and weeks ahead. Next week, when we start digging into the chapter discussions, chapters 1 through 3 this week, and then chapters 4 through 8 next week, what you're going to see is that those are more fixed and locked. Those are not as open as the literary criticism questions. So kind of hang out with me for those questions, for the literary criticism, and then each week you want to be very, very intentional about answering those questions in a timely way on the basis of those chapters that you're reading through. Furthermore, to this end, as you're kind of divvying up the work, what I said in my announcement, I think 2 days ago at this point, I think I told y'all that we had a baby in our house now, and so time is basically meaningless to my wife and I. So I think it was 2 days ago that I would have sent an announcement out to you, and I said realistically in all of my classes I expect students to read about 80% of the work. And, I know that it's a lot. It's going to be like a fire hose once we get started, which is today, Wednesday, June the 4th. So as we're going through the material and as we're reading the material, you want to make a good faith effort of reading the material, reading chapter by chapter on your own, and again, relying on your classmates to answer the questions with you in a thorough and robust way, and also look over their shoulder and expand on something that they may have just given a short answer on. But I do ask that you go through the material, that you are able to kind of process what you're thinking and what you're feeling and what you're seeing and what you're reading as we're placing the Bible in a historical context with Harris. And when you get to that point where you're just overwhelmed between answering the questions and doing the essays and doing the readings and all these other assignments that you have just with this class alone, I would say, I understand you probably will not be taking in all of the readings, but you want to be able to rely on one another so that someone in your groups or someone in the class is able to kind of step up as you are stepping back. And as you are taking a breath, someone is stepping forward. And relying on one another and being more collaborative in our approach has historically been pretty successful with a class that is crunched up together, as this class is during a summer session. You're not doing anything wrong if you feel overwhelmed. I am going through this material with you. I am also overwhelmed. That is a normal response. I don't want to say, oh man, you should be reading every single letter and every single word. I've had those instructors. I hate those instructors. What's more important to me is that you're able to move through this material and that you're able to process it, that you're able to put it into some sort of context and some sort of frame of understanding for yourself. And if you're just overwhelmed and you don't have time to think or time to process, it's not going to be good for you. It's just not going to be a good experience. And if you find yourself in that position, I would say, please, please, please take a step back. You have my permission. You have my blessing to take a step back, take a breath, and if necessary, send me, an email so that we can talk and that we can kind of move through the material together, you and I, on an individual level. If we need to have a roundtable where all of us are meeting at the same time, by all means, that is also possible. But remember that this is an asynchronous or not time-based class, so it may be helpful if just one or two of you show up with questions. We can get to that down the line. For right now, what's important is that we begin to divvy up the work, that we begin to work collaboratively, we begin to rely on one another, and that we understand that, yes, this is a lot of information in a short amount of time. You're not doing anything wrong. If you feel that way, let's rely on one another to get through it, okay?